This lecture is part of the History 363 Modern Africa class at Flagler College. Our topic for this lecture is African nationalism, the rise of nationalism in the 1940s and 50s. All of this in preparation for a discussion of the period of kind of the quest for independence and ultimately a discussion of independent Africa. Nationalism came rather late to Africa. Nationalism is a modern system of thought originating in Europe, arguably. There are some very good studies of nationalism that I would recommend. Sort of a classic is Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities. Another one is Ernst Gellner's Nations and Nationalism, I think it's called. These talk about the rise of a culture, coupled with a sense of kind of social identity and maybe ethnic identity that is fostered through the press, through media, this happened in Europe really in the 18th century, with antecedents maybe in a couple of centuries before that. And then spread to other parts of the world over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Africa resisted nationalism, not on sort of ideological grounds, but because of the great complexity of the continent itself. And also because colonialism came to Africa rather late as well, as we've seen, really the last couple of decades of the 19th century. It's only then do we have kind of full-blown colonialism, really not complete until around the end of the First World War. And so these nationalist ideas that would have diffused to Africa from Europe came correspondingly late. Now, there are, I think, antecedents of African nationalism, back into the 19th century, but there's a great deal of regional diversity. Nationalism does not make it to all of Africa at the same time. I think we can talk very clearly about Egyptian nationalism, for instance, maybe even in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. But other regions developed ideas of nationalism probably not until the 1950s. And there were other aspects. I mean, the complexities is really sort of a general way of saying this. Under the colonial system, the geographic entities were mostly very artificial. Take Nigeria as an example. Nigeria incorporated territory that was very ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse, religiously diverse. The northern part of Nigeria is made up of Hausa Fulani peoples who are Muslims, speak a different language, and live in a very different geographic setting, which is the Sahel, the Savannah region there, dry, there's a mix of agriculture and herding historically. Southern Nigeria is in the into the rainforest or into the jungle, and there's also the coastland there, which had a history of interacting with Europeans via the transatlantic slave trade, much more than the interior did. Exposure to Christianity because of that interaction with Europe. And also these peoples who lived very much a kind of rainforest existence with a different kind of agriculture and certainly different forms of political and social organization. They spoke languages that were very different from the Hausa Fulani, even from different language families. So you can see that's a tremendous amount of diversity there. Yet those peoples were all thrown together under the same colonial jurisdiction. The same went for lots of other places as well. I mean, the complexities were just sort of breathtaking here. Add to that the fact that the colonial apparatus itself was built to profit Europeans. It was not built to unite African peoples under the same colonial banner. Infrastructure was built to extract goods, mostly agricultural goods, from whatever places they were most productive in, to be sent to ports and then shipped to Europe. And so even though things like the railroad may have united people more than had been the case previously, there was no effort made necessarily to bring these peoples together to the point where they could develop a sense of common purpose and an idea of a nation. In fact, in some cases, there was an active effort to stop people from identifying with each other, particularly in areas of high white settlement, high European settlement, South Africa being the most extreme case, but French Algeria, Kenya, Rhodesia, places like this. The structures were put into place to make sure that, people from one group, one tribe, I think is probably the word the Europeans would have used, from keep them from uniting with people of another group or another tribe. And so, this is particularly the case under apartheid South Africa, as we'll talk about later in this presentation. And so the colonial apparatus did very little to introduce Africans to ideas of nationalism or to the structures that would be necessary for ideas of nationalism to develop, and in fact, in many cases, tried to prevent such ideas from winding up in African hands, so to speak. Now, the ideas of nationalism do develop within groups protesting the colonial situation. Particularly after the Second World War, with some regions arriving at that sooner. And so a good example, again, would be Egypt here. We talked about this in the last lecture, but in the 1920s, technically, Britain offered Egypt independence, though they still controlled much of the economy, all of the military and foreign affairs, as well as Egypt's historical claim to the Sudan. Britain insisted that that was a separate colony. And so there were lots of reasons why the Egyptians didn't like this, and really kind of fought against this grant of independence. There were elections held that many people saw as a sham because they were under British control. The monarchy in Egypt was set up as a check to any sort of parliamentary ambitions that might seek to remove European influence, this really ended up in kind of a mess politically. Parliament was seen as ineffectual. The king was seen as corrupt. The British were seen as never going to go away. It's really from this that, as we'll see, that nationalism continues to develop in situations like that, and it takes an increasingly radical edge or a radical line to it. And Egypt is different, certainly, than other places. The sort of nationalism that developed in the Gold Coast region in West Africa, for instance, was modeled after, very much after the Indian nationalist movement headed by Mohandas Gandhi, or at least inspired by Mohandas Gandhi. And was nonviolent, really sort of peaceful protest, civil disobedience, these sorts of things. That was attempted in other places. When it didn't work, they turned to violence, and so protests could take many forms. Another key development that's related to the rise of nationalism is, and the textbook actually contains a fairly good discussion of this, and so I'll leave it partly to Richard Reed, our textbook author, to explain that. But Africa became apparent as a concept to Africans only in the middle of the 20th century. They didn't think in terms of the continent. They didn't think about the unity of African peoples necessarily. Until the rise of the Negritude movement, this sense of Africanness, the unity of all people of African descent. Initially, that was largely an African diaspora phenomenon, rising out of intellectuals in the United States and in the Caribbean, people like Marcus Garvey and Aimé Césaire, were the initial proponents of negritude and of this sense of Africanness. But those ideas gradually spread into Africa, partly through channels of education as Africans went, or people from Africa went to the United States or went to Europe to gain university educations. They came into contact with other proponents of negritude, and this sense of unity of Africans really was fostered in that kind of intellectual environment. When these educated Africans then went back to Africa and became key figures in the burgeoning political movements, began to talk about the unity of Africans, that it's really only then that that Africa as a concept began to really take root in people's lives. Now, this isn't directly related, and we're not talking about African nationalism. There's no nationalism on the scale of the continent. In fact, the Pan-African movement, which did become political and not just ideological, was in some ways inimical to the rise of nationalism, because nationalism, it was apparent, was going to observe the lines drawn by European colonial powers. That nationalism was going to take place within these artificially created territorial entities that were part of colonialism. And so, people who argued for Pan-Africanism fought against this. But Pan-Africanism itself was not terribly practical. I mean, uniting the second largest continent on the world under the same banner with again, the breathtaking complexity linguistically and ethnically and socially and politically was an impossible task. And so you can see how these African intellectuals are kind of at odds with each other, and even at odds with themselves. Many Pan-African proponents eventually are won over to the idea of nationalism and become leaders of nationalist movements. The man pictured here on the slide is Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana. He initially was a Pan-African proponent, and eventually, was won over to the idea of Ghanaian nationalism. And so all of this is kind of being worked out in the era of the Second World War and the immediate aftermath of that, as more and more of these Africans link up with intellectuals coming from the African diaspora to develop this idea of Africa as something that they should be committed to. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, please raise the discussion please raise questions on the discussion board about this. Now, political parties begin to take shape within this setting, and some of these parties date back to the beginning of the 20th century. The African National Congress in South Africa was founded in 1912, for instance, with other parties in South Africa founded even a bit before that. The South African, I can't remember the exact name of the, anyway, there was a political party of people of Asian descent in South Africa that was developed around the same time, and the organization of mixed race people, the colored people or the Griqua people, was even about a decade before the ANC there. There were political parties developed in places like Egypt and Algeria, Tunisia, going back into the very beginning of the 20th century as well. Their goals initially were, well, they were mixed. Some spokesmen or some formulators of ideas within these political parties were seeking for representation in the government of the metropole. And so they wanted to be elected to, say, the French Assembly or the British Parliament, or at least have representation there. Others wanted some form of local autonomy under the colonial system. I mean, there are various ideas sort of put forward, mostly within the sorts of parameters that were part of colonialism. Ideas about parliamentary democracies and things like this, a power-sharing arrangement under colonial auspices, perhaps. it took them a while, most of them at least a while, to get at the idea that having an independent African nation would be feasible. Not because Africans resisted that necessarily, but because the colonial powers were insistent that that was not going to happen, and they actively discouraged that. After the Second World War, though, this really stepped into high gear, and the desire for for parliamentary representation, even autonomous political organization began to the calls began to ring very loudly. And so European powers, some of them at least, the British, the French, less so the Belgians and the Portuguese, um, uh, saw that they were, in their minds, this was an inevitable conclusion, at least in most of the situations they had going in Africa. But they wanted to slow play this. They thought it was going to take probably at least many decades for there to be a full transfer of power. And so the colonial powers, at least the British and the French, began to court certain political parties, the ones that they approved of, the ones that seemed most malleable, the ones whom they thought they could mentor. These didn't end up being the ones in many cases that won out, and the colonial powers had to adjust on the fly. And as we'll see, the British and French sort of get at this early and start to work with homegrown African political parties, trying to shape them. The Belgians and the Portuguese really resist any effort on the part of Africans to organize politically like this, except in the most meager ways, until the pressure just becomes so great that they're forced to capitulate. So we'll see how that happens. Now, because the colonial governments were trying to slow play African political development, many of these groups become increasingly radical. And so Egypt is a good example here again, when we've talked about after the British really tried to thwart the efforts of the Waft Party, which came to power in Egyptian parliament in the 1920s, setting them off against the power of the king, who was backed by the British government, the king at times dissolving the Egyptian parliament when the Waft won a majority of seats. And over time, people became sick of not only this whole runaround that they were getting from the British with the division of the king and the parliament, but even the Waft Party began to wane in popularity. And the alternative there was, there's the Young Egyptian Party, which was quite radical, socialist, eventually, started to court the favors of, at times, eventually even the Soviet Union, but also the Muslim Brotherhood, who entered into a kind of alliance with the Young Egyptians and with some of the military officers who emerged at the leadership positions among the Young Egyptians. The Muslim Brotherhood was very much a Muslim kind of hardline, conservative, we may even say fundamentalist organization, insisting on the primacy of Sharia law. But they backed the Young Egyptians, and the Waft fell out of favor. These, the ones that took their place were willing to take extreme measures, and the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser and independent Egypt in the 1950s, and the eventual nationalization of the Suez Canal and the blow-up that followed that, I should say, were the results really of the British trying to halt the flow of progress in Egypt, very much so, and forcing these people to turn to radical solutions. In many places, largely due to regional and ethnic tensions, think again upon the example of Nigeria, between the House of Fulani Muslims in the north and the Yoruba in the southwest and the Igbo in the southeast, with a lot of minority peoples kind of sort of interspersed throughout. There was a great deal of ethnic tension, and any single political party had to try to bridge those divides between different ethnicities, and this was not an easy task. This was not something that came quickly. Parties were formed in places like Nigeria, and they were never able to reach any kind of consensus because of the rivalries between, the northern Muslims and the southern Christians, between the Yoruba and the Igbo, which was a historic tension that had developed. I think that Richard Reed, our textbook author, is right in saying that here the legacies of the 19th century, the sorts of rivalries that develop in the 19th century with different groups gaining control of various parts of Africa, and then ultimately all of that being subsumed under colonial jurisdiction, that meant that those rivalries never fully played themselves out and remained kind of in limbo. And as Africa began to emerge and to gain independence, those 19th century rivalries remained in place, and they had to be worked out. And in many cases, that working out of those 19th century rivalries, lasted long beyond the grant of independence, and to some extent may even be around all the way to the present. Another good example, by the way, is Uganda, where the British had sort of co-opted the Buganda, or the Ganda people, even though they were not the only ethnic group in the area. The Nyoro and others were also there. The Kabaka, the king of Buganda, had remained kind of a British indirect rule chief all through colonialism, and was transformed in the process. But in any case, the Ganda had a privileged position, and any sort of efforts to form a political party to create a national identity in Uganda was going to have to compete with the privileged position that the Ganda had relative to these other ethnic groups. In fact, as the British were negotiating with the people of Uganda for transfers of power for elections and things like that, the Ganda insisted that they should be autonomous within Uganda, that they should be a separate government within the larger government, and that was really not a viable solution to that. So there again, the 19th century legacy was still was a major factor, was something that was not going to go away for a long time. There was a great deal of change in the parties themselves between a contrast that we can draw between the pre-war version of the party, which acted very much within the colonial apparatus, and the post-war party, where many of these Africans had gone off and fought in the war on the side of the Europeans. They felt that they were owed a debt. They argued they had extracted, even in some cases, guarantees of of transfers of power, of real political power, even perhaps of independence after a time. And so parties took a much harder line with Europeans, and let's face it, Europeans were in a more vulnerable position after the war than they had been before, and so this meant that the nationalist ideas and the cohesion of political parties tended to be greater after the war, and become a major factor in these societies. But these parties were not just negative. They were not just parties of no. They didn't just identify what they didn't want, that is, maybe other ethnicities or the colonial apparatus. They also, their rhetoric, their stated political goals were very much positive forces that won people over to their banner, that united people, got people excited about the possibilities of independence, about having their own autonomy, their own self-rule. In some cases, this flew in the face of traditional authorities. It certainly undercut what little authority remained among the indirect rule chiefs, who some of them at least, went kicking and screaming into the new order. But this, for the first time, really, the possibility of unity, even in divided situations, made itself apparent. But it was going to take some time for a political culture to be created, for people to become accustomed to functioning politically in ways that were both autonomous and validating of the values of the claims that people had on a government. I mean, the imagination, so to speak, had to be shaped before this could be put into effect, before people could become accustomed to thinking in terms of voting and representation and parliament and having a president and having a government that somehow transcended ethnicity and traditional structures, and that's really one of the key themes, I think, of the 1950s and maybe even into the 1960s, is this effort to create a political culture. In some cases, the transfer of power is so sudden, like in the Congo, the Belgian Congo, that there was no time for a political culture to be created, and that's one of the reasons that the Congo ended up in such a mess in the 1960s. That this simply hadn't happened yet, and Belgium suddenly said, "You're going to be independent, and we're leaving." Okay. Now, the European response to both nationalist ideas and to the rise of these political parties was mixed. I said the British and the French were willing in many cases, not all cases. Algeria was seen by the French as inviolable, as an extension of France itself, and there was really no desire on the part of the French to negotiate any sort of transfer of power, because there were, after all, hundreds of thousands, a couple million, something like that, French settlers in Algeria. That wasn't going to happen. Certainly the same for South Africa. The South Africans, who were acting increasingly independent of Britain, were not going to turn power over in any measure to the black population, except under these kind of sham native reserve systems. But in other places there was a recognition that some kind of transfer of power needed to happen, that they needed to find a partner whom they could prepare, whom they could mentor. This is all the kind of in the European mind, who would be willing to gain independence on terms that were very favorable to the Europeans. These are the sorts of calculations that the British and the French were making. The Belgians, after the war, saw the Congo as so important to their effort at rebuilding that they really made no effort at all to try to transfer power or to prepare anyone for the adoption of independence. And the same with the Portuguese. The Portuguese were tremendously reliant on their colonies. They even stepped up efforts to settle poor Portuguese people in places like Angola after the war, and really were, had no desire ever, I think, in their minds to let these things go. And so we have this kind of spectrum of European responses. One key transitionary phase of and in some cases the kind of initial phase of the transfer of power and the rise of independence comes with the election of local councils in some colonies. So in the Gold Coast, in Nigeria, in the French West Africa, Senegal, and places like that, the colonial powers organized elections for local representatives, and the creation of these kind of parliamentary structures that would function under the auspices of the colonial government, that would have limited powers to make decisions, that would certainly be vetoed if the Europeans saw that as necessary by colonial governors and other powers that be. But this started on the local level, and this is in a way a transition away from indirect ruled chiefs and toward an acknowledgement that Africans wanted and were going to demand European-style governments. Beyond the local councils were territorial assemblies. But the whole goal, and so these are things that happen on a more regional level, even perhaps the colonial-wide level. Or the colony-wide level, I guess, is the way to say that. The goal here is to share power. To give a little bit, sort of to trickle the power into African hands, and to shape the minds of the leaders so that they will be willing to, again, be favorable to European interests even over the long term. Well, these elected African officials were in so many cases not willing to compromise. They wanted more. They wanted it immediately. And so, these political parties who felt that things weren't moving fast enough began to take more measures to force the Europeans toward independence. One of these is the boycott of European companies. That Africans, who had been for decades now a captive market in many cases, the European companies were the only ones selling certain goods in the colonies, and so following the example of Gandhi with his the effort to produce their own salt, to spin their own cloth. Gandhi was famous for these kinds of things. Many Africans began to take up the same sort of cause, and talk about producing their own goods, and ceasing the practice of buying things from Europeans. In other cases, leaders of nationalist movements and political parties began to at least entertain the idea that they had to use violence in order to force the colonial power to hand over, or the colonial authorities to hand over power. Violence could take many forms, everything from industrial sabotage to what we might call terrorism, to outright warfare, and we see all of those attempted eventually. And there's kind of a spectrum in places where there was more white settlement, where the Europeans were totally intransigent in their talk of turning power over to Africans. Then full-scale warfare ended up being the only thing that would force Europeans to leave, and this is why there's a terribly bloody war fought in Algeria over independence beginning in 1954 and extending into the early 1960s. That was truly a horrific campaign, and we'll have, we may have more to say about that later. But so violence was another option that people began to at least throw around here, starting in kind of the 1950s. In areas of high white settlement, the challenges of nationalist movements, as we've already said, were much greater. And these did vary. In Algeria, the main focus of the French government was the coastal region where the French settlers were. Some greater measure of autonomy was granted to peoples of the interior into the Sahara, but there was really no effort on the part of the French, no desire to hand any sort of power over to the Algerians because there were so many French people living there. Kenya was a different case. There were only a few thousand European settlers, but they lived mostly on, in one of two places, either large rural plantations in what were known as the White Highlands, the agricultural region of Kenya, or if they had decided that farming wasn't for them, either because their farms had not been productive or they just got sick of living the rural existence, there was a large white population in the cities of Kenya, especially Nairobi and Mombasa, and these people were engaged in trade and some industry and things like that. And so in Kenya, the colonial power was really in charge of the government there. So Britain administered that directly, and the settlers themselves didn't have a lot of power, didn't have their own kind of autonomous government. In Rhodesia, on the other hand, starting in the 1920s and increasing up into the 1950s, the white settlers in Rhodesia had extracted greater and greater amounts of independence from Britain itself. And so power was largely in the hands of the people actually on the ground rather than somebody sent from London to oversee the situation. And this was even, I mean, exponentially more the case in South Africa, where really Britain had little oversight of any of that. South Africa was just part of the empire and part of what was emerging as the Commonwealth. But in 1961, the South African government broke entirely, at least on a kind of formal diplomatic level, from Britain and became fully independent. And in that case, of course, there were extreme measures taken to ensure that whites would be the only privileged group, the only group with any access to government at all, and with any sort of access to industrialized modern world stuff. And so we need to acknowledge that we can't just treat all of these entities as exactly the same. They're very different in character. And so their incentives and their goals are different. I mean, for the most part, their goal was to retain power, but they did so for different reasons. Algeria was seen by the French as part of France, and so this was not something they could negotiate away. That'd be like giving up Marseille or giving up the Riviera or giving up Bordeaux or Gascony or something like that. It just was unthinkable for the French. Kenya was a different story. Really, that was about holding on to territory and holding on to the economic power there rather than political power. And then, the goal of political authority in white hands really was the main focus of the governments of Rhodesia and especially South Africa. And so in some cases there was compromise with the Africans, with the native Africans. This was particularly the case, I think, in Kenya, where they handed over some land to people from time to time, as more white settlers moved off of the rural plantations. In some cases, they allowed Africans to settle in those areas. And there were some efforts made at compromise. In other places, little to no compromise, and really just a tendency toward a violent crackdown on anyone fomenting for nationalism, for independence, for autonomy. South Africa is the extreme case here, and it's this era, not coincidentally, that sees the rise of the whole system of apartheid. Now, segregation had been put into place. I mean, really, we could find antecedents of that going back all the way to the 18th century. But the system of apartheid as a system, as a fully formed system, came into being in the 1950s. In 1948, the National Party under D.F. Malan, I've already said this in other lectures, so sorry for the repetition, but it's important to underscore these points. So National Party under D.F. Malan won a very close election, largely because the British people who lived in South Africa could not unite under a single banner, and so the Afrikaner-based National Party ended up winning full control of the South African Parliament and of the seat of the Prime Minister. And so D.F. Malan, Daniel Malan, became the Prime Minister, and he had campaigned. The National Party had campaigned on a platform of apartheid. This is an Afrikaans word. It means separateness. And the Native Affairs Minister under Malan was a fellow named Hendrik Forvert. And Forvert is actually worth looking up. You spell his name Verwoerd. It's pronounced Forvert. He was born in Holland. He wasn't even from South Africa originally, but moved there when he was a child, and had developed this very strong sense of the racial superiority of the white race, and was also a very good organizer, a highly educated man, was fluent not only in Afrikaans but also in English, and was In fact, a good idea would be to look him up on YouTube. There are a couple of speeches on YouTube that he gave where you can see his kind of disarming speaking style, and he presents a really sort of amiable face to the rest of the world. Well, he was the main architect of apartheid. He was the one who put all of these things into place. He understood what would sell, how this could be made palatable to the rest of the world that was beginning to move away from racism with all of the horrific revelations of what the Nazis had done with their racial ideology. And so now the system of apartheid really is quite complex. It's not just the kinds of segregation that we see under Jim Crow in the American South. It's much more systematic, much more invasive even than that. There were separate facilities, like we saw in the American South, so separate restroom facilities, separate train platforms, separate cars for people to ride in on the trains, separate beach access, separate drinking fountains, and other things like that, although there's not a lot of drinking fountains in South Africa. But it wasn't just those structures of segregation. There weren't even really, schools were not segregated because for the most part, the natives, what the people that the Afrikaners called Bantus, which was a total misnomer because Bantu was a very generic term. There were lots of different groups of people who spoke Bantu languages in South Africa. Even today, South Africa has 11 official languages, most of which are Bantu languages, and so you can see the kind of complexity that existed there. But the way that the South Africans pitched this to the rest of the world was that the Bantus needed to be removed from white European-based civilization because it would in some way retard their development as a people, that this was unnatural for them, that they need to be left to self-determine. And so this prompted what was maybe the most unjust and really kind of cruel aspect of apartheid, which was the creation of these so-called homelands, these native reserves. With the Group Areas Act, a law passed in 1950, they took, and this had antecedents previous to that time. They took part of South Africa and this never reached more than about 13% of the total land of South Africa. And these became designated as homelands. These tended to be on marginal land, and legally under apartheid, African people belonged to the homelands, even if they had never lived there, even if they had been born in Johannesburg and had never set foot in the Transkei or the Ciskei or KwaZulu or one of these places, or Bophuthatswana. They belonged to the homeland, thus they were foreigners on South African soil and could be subjected to all of the strictures placed on immigrants who were not citizens. They also divided these homelands by ethnicity to further keep people from organizing together, and so the Xhosa were placed in the Transkei and Ciskei, the Zulu in KwaZulu, the Tswana people in Bophuthatswana, the Sotho in Xwakwa, and other places, and they kept them apart from each other. In the urban areas, especially in Johannesburg, where there was a lot of mining, of course, and industrial output, and where they needed black laborers, they would force these people to have passes. They had to have signed contracts with expiration dates in order to get passes so that they could live in these places. They forced them to live in townships. I talked in an earlier lecture about Soweto, the southwest townships, which grew into, population-wise, the largest city in South Africa. Soweto probably had a population at its height of several million people. Maybe I've heard estimates as high as 8 million people lived in Soweto. Probably wasn't that high, but a lot of people certainly lived there. And these were designated as areas for non-citizen African Bantu peoples to live in. And they initially tried to divide the townships themselves up by ethnicity, creating a Xhosa neighborhood and a Zulu neighborhood and a Sotho neighborhood and things like that. But people began to integrate themselves, and the authorities really could do little to stop them from that. And so, and the homelands themselves were poorly administered. They were never autonomous, even though the South African government, the apartheid government, said that they were. The leaders of the homelands were corrupt. They were puppets of the South African regime. They were in the pay of the South African regime. They didn't have their own currencies. They didn't have any outside access at all. They had no ports or airports or anything that could allow them to make trade agreements, even if they could produce anything worth trading, with other people. The population densities were so high and the lack of infrastructure was so stark that the land was quickly exhausted of all of its nutrients, and they couldn't even grow food there. The soil erosion was terrible. I could go on about the consequences of this. The population density on these homelands was as high as something like 800 people per square mile in some places, with no infrastructure, with no paved roads, with very few water systems or sewage systems or anything like this. And that was where these African people were supposed to live. Well, it was natural that they wanted to go live in other places. Of course, there was no economic opportunity in the homelands, and so the men at least had to go other places, and increasingly women did too, to work as domestic servants. Well, this split families up. This left parents without children. There was very little education in the homelands except that which was sponsored by mission schools, and it was actually from mission schools that many of the leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle emerged. From Fort Hare University in the Transkei, for instance, came Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, the main leaders of the African National Congress, and they were all schooled in this mission environment. Whereas in the white-controlled areas, the education system was first-rate. The university system in South Africa was of the same quality that one might find in the industrialized modern world. Healthcare was great. Hospitals were modern. There were lots of doctors. South Africans were involved in scientific research. It was a South African doctor, for instance, who performed the first heart transplant ever. In the well, I don't remember exactly when that was. No, it was the first artificial heart, I think, in the 1980s. But in any case, so that's just one indication of the advancement of the areas under white control. But the homelands and the townships were most definitely developing countries or third world countries. In some of the homelands, the infant mortality rate was among the highest in the world. I think it was like second highest in the world at one point, with somewhere around 120 per 1,000 children not living to the age of 2. And so it's understandable why people began to resist this. And the resistance came primarily from the African National Congress, though initially that was not a terribly important group, really only represented kind of the small black middle class, the educated people early on. There was more of an effort at resistance made by workers' unions like the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union that we talked about in a previous lecture. But the ANC emerged really with its youth wing, led again by Mandela and Sisulu and Tambo, in the late 1940s, and in the early 1950s. With these men at its head, really at its ideological core, the ANC began organizing things like boycotts of Afrikaner businesses and strikes, workers' strikes, boycotts of the transportation industry that was controlled by whites and that kept raising prices on the people who needed to get from the townships to the mines or to the factories. And all of this resistance, this non-violent resistance that came from the example of Gandhi, was met with extreme violence by the apartheid government, that they simply weren't going to stand for this, and police cracked down. And this is going to lead eventually to increased violence and to ultimately the arrest and jailing of many of the leaders of the ANC. So that's for a later class. But this is, this era that we're talking about, late 40s, early 1950s, sees the beginning of that resistance. Last theme here with nationalism, and one that's related, is that Africa becomes an entity to be paid attention to on the international level. Africa gained some respect, culturally gained some respect in this period. And some of this had to do with scholarship. Scholars in Europe and the United States began to study Africa historically, anthropologically, sociologically, began to appreciate and study African art and music and things like this, and not just as a sort of curiosity of the primitive world, as was the case in the 19th century. And there also emerged in this period some figures, scholarly and literary, among Africans themselves. Many of these people, as you can see in the picture here, being receiving degrees from universities, some of them in Africa, in places like Fort Hare, as I said, but many Africans going to the United States or to Europe to receive university educations, and at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, for instance, the first department of African history was developed under the leadership of Kenneth Dike, who received his PhD from King's College in London in 1950. And Africans begin to write their own history. And the writing of history is an important facet of nationalism. Now, to have a historical sense and a historical identity is a key component of nationalism. That's one of the arguments of Benedict Anderson and others who have written about nationalism. African art, is no longer seen just as a kind of quaint product of these savage peoples, and it begins to be appreciated on its own terms with its own aesthetic. And museums and galleries dedicated to African art begin to emerge in different parts of the world. And more native publications, newspapers, magazines, other things that are so necessary for the rise of a political culture and a national consciousness also begin to emerge, both in Africa and internationally, dedicated to African issues. And so Africa begins to take shape as a culture, and thus more attention began to be paid to the plight of the peoples in Africa, and more respect shown to their nationalist ambitions, at least in some cases. So we'll leave it at that. We'll have more to say then in the coming lectures about the rise of independence movements and the success that they end up having in gaining independence, and then moving on from there into independent Africa. As this class is structured, students are required to take over some of the teaching of the section on independent Africa, and so we'll talk about that on the discussion boards. Thank you very much.